The first time Derek Broaddus stepped inside the house at 657 Boulevard, he felt an overwhelming sense of pride. It wasn't just any house, it was the house. The dream home. The one he and his wife, Maria, had talked about for years. Now, finally, it was theirs. The Grand Colonial, with its sweeping front yard and ivy-covered brick walls, looked every bit as majestic as the photos on the real estate website. The perfect place to start a family. They had 2 young children, a boy and a girl, both excited to move into their new home. Derek, a successful executive, could hardly contain his joy. The neighborhood seemed quiet, friendly, exactly what they were looking for. They had already started planning the renovations. The possibilities were endless. It was supposed to be the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. Maria shared his excitement. She had already started envisioning the kids running around in the large backyard, their laughter echoing through the house. It felt like the American dream. But that dream, which should have been filled with happiness, would soon be shattered in ways they could never have imagined. The first letter came just days after they moved in. It wasn't much, just a plain white envelope, the kind you'd expect a bill to come in. There was no return address, just the words "the new owner" scrawled on the front in uneven handwriting. Derek opened it curiously, expecting perhaps a welcome note from a neighbor. What he read instead made his blood run cold. "Dearest new neighbor at 657 Boulevard, I have been put in charge of watching you. I am the watcher. I have been in control of 657 Boulevard for the better part of 2 decades now, and it is my job to watch you and your family. I know you've just moved in, but I'm already quite familiar with you. Your children's names are on the house's blueprints. I have been watching your every move." At first, Derek thought it was some sort of joke. Maybe a prank from one of his friends. But as he continued to read, his unease grew. The letter went on to describe his children, how old they were, where their bedrooms were located, and even what time of day they typically played outside. It mentioned things that no one could have known unless they were watching. "I see you have a young daughter. I think you'll be very pleased with the renovations you've made. I can see you plan to fix up the basement. That's a nice touch. But I have to wonder, are you aware of what's inside the walls? The watcher has been here long before you." Derek's stomach twisted. The tone of the letter wasn't violent, but it was unsettling. A slow, creeping sense of dread began to wash over him. Who would send something like this? Why? And what did it mean that the watcher had been in control of the house for so long? At first, Derek tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just a bored neighbor, someone with too much time on their hands. But as days passed and no one came forward to claim the letter, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Maria, too, was disturbed. She'd read the letter, and though she tried to stay calm, the fear in her eyes was impossible to ignore. "It's just a prank," she told Derek, trying to reassure him. "Some kid in the neighborhood trying to get attention." But Derek couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach. Who would send a letter like that? And how could they know so much about their family already? The Broadduses, determined to dismiss it as a fluke, tried to move on. They went about their days, unpacking boxes and settling into their new home, but something in the back of Derek's mind kept gnawing at him. He decided to share the letter with a few trusted friends, hoping they would offer some perspective. Maybe they would laugh it off, tell him it was nothing to worry about. But that didn't happen. One friend, a retired police officer, was immediately concerned. "You should take this seriously," he advised Derek. "If it's not a prank, it could be someone watching you. And if they've been watching you for a while, they might know things you don't even realize." Despite the unease, Derek still tried to convince himself it was just a harmless joke. Maybe the previous owners had some strange neighbor who sent letters like that. He had read stories about the weird things that sometimes came with buying an old house. A quirky neighbor, maybe a little eccentric, but harmless. He'd heard of stranger things. But as the days turned into weeks, he couldn't shake the feeling that the watcher's words were a warning he couldn't ignore. Then, just as Derek was starting to feel a little more settled in, another letter arrived. This one was worse. "You have children. I have seen them. So have my friends. They watch you as well." The letter was short and even more disturbing than the first. The watcher was no longer playing games. It was clear that whoever was writing these letters was closer than he was comfortable with. Derek felt exposed, vulnerable. This wasn't just someone sending random letters, they were watching them. But how? Who were they? And how had they known about their kids' names? Their routines? Each letter was signed off with the same ominous line, "The Watcher." Derek went to the police. But even they couldn't offer much help. The letters, while creepy, weren't overtly threatening. They didn't contain any direct threats of violence. The police advised him to keep the letters as evidence, but they didn't seem to take the situation as seriously as Derek did. The more time passed, the more isolated Derek felt. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was lurking in the shadows, watching his every move. His mind raced. Could it be someone who had lived in the house before? Someone who had become attached to it and couldn't bear to let go? As weeks turned into months, the fear gnawed at them. Derek and Maria couldn't even enjoy their dream home anymore. Every sound felt amplified. Every shadow seemed darker. They were trapped in a nightmare, unable to escape the grip of the mysterious watcher. And then, just when they thought it couldn't get any worse, another letter arrived. Derek couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was like a constant, gnawing presence that followed him wherever he went. Every time he stepped out of the house, he felt eyes on him, lurking in the shadows, waiting for him to let his guard down. The house, which once held so much promise, now felt suffocating. He couldn't escape the thought that the watcher was always one step ahead. The letters continued to arrive, each one more ominous than the last. The first letter had been unsettling, but the second was even worse. The watcher wasn't just observing them anymore, it was as if they were being mocked. The letter didn't just talk about the Broaddus children, it spoke directly to them, knowing their names, their routines, and even the smallest details about their lives. Derek showed the second letter to Maria, and she recoiled in horror as she read the words aloud. "I see you've painted the upstairs room pink for your daughter. That's a nice touch. She's growing so fast, isn't she?" The watcher knew about their daughter's room. They knew about the renovations they had made, the personal touches they had added to make the house feel like home. The creeping suspicion that someone had been watching them from the shadows now felt like a reality. Maria, though shaken, tried to stay rational. "It's just someone who knows too much about the house. Maybe the previous owners mentioned something in passing to someone. People in the neighborhood talk, right?" But Derek wasn't convinced. The tone of the letters didn't seem like something that could be explained away by chance. The watcher wasn't just observing from afar. No, it felt personal. It felt wrong. Then came the third letter. This time, the message was different. More direct. The watcher, it seemed, was growing bolder. "You have children. I have seen them. I know what they play with. I know when they sleep. I know when you will be home and when you will be gone. I have been watching you for months. You should have left when I told you to." Derek read the letter multiple times, his hands trembling. "What does this mean?" he muttered, more to himself than to Maria. The words were haunting. The watcher had been watching them for months. That wasn't just an exaggeration. That was a statement of fact. Whoever the watcher was, they had been keeping track of their every move, waiting, watching. The letter didn't just mention their children, it implied something far more sinister. The watcher knew the family schedule, their comings and goings. It knew when Derek was at work, when Maria was at home, when the kids were at school or playing outside. And worse, it suggested that the Broadduses should have left the house when they had the chance. That phrase, "you should have left when I told you to," was the one that stuck with Derek the most. What did that mean? Had the watcher been warning them all along? If they had ignored the first letter, was it now too late to leave? Was the watcher growing more desperate? Maria, in tears, called the police again, but their response was no different than before. They could only advise the Broadduses to be cautious, to keep the letters and document any further communication. But that wasn't enough. The Broadduses were scared. They didn't know if they were being watched in real time or if the watcher was waiting for the right moment to make their presence known. The police conducted a brief investigation but turned up nothing. No fingerprints on the letters. No leads on who could be behind them. The letters seemed to come from nowhere, yet they contained details that seemed impossible to explain. The Broadduses were left in the dark, surrounded by unanswered questions and an overwhelming sense of dread. That's when the phone calls started. It began with a single, quiet ring. Derek answered the phone, expecting it to be a telemarketer or a wrong number. But when he picked up, the line was eerily silent. For several moments, he thought he had gotten the wrong number and was about to hang up. But then, just as he was about to disconnect, he heard a whisper. "I'm watching you." The line went dead. Derek was stunned. He checked the number, but there was no caller ID. It was just a random, untraceable number. Was it a prank? Was it the same person behind the letters? Or was it someone else entirely, trying to push them to the brink? For days, the phone rang sporadically, always with the same silence on the other end, followed by that chilling whisper, "I'm watching you." It wasn't just the phone calls. Derek began to feel an oppressive weight in the house itself. At night, the house seemed unnaturally quiet. The air felt thicker, as though it was suffused with an invisible presence. He would lie awake, staring into the darkness, feeling as though someone was in the room with him, watching him from the shadows. He'd hear strange creaks, whispers that couldn't be explained, like someone was walking through the house when he knew he was alone. And every morning there was a new letter. It became a twisted routine. They would wake up expecting to find another one waiting on the doorstep, another piece of evidence that someone, somewhere, was watching them. The letters didn't stop. The Watcher didn't stop. The contents were becoming more unnerving. The Watcher seemed to grow more brazen with each letter. One of the letters described Derek's routine in excruciating detail, listing out the exact times he left for work, when he came home, and even when he took his dog for walks. "I know you think you can escape, but you can't. I'll be watching." Derek's paranoia grew. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of it all. Who was behind this? Why was this happening to them? The family's dream home had turned into a nightmare, and there was no way out. No way to escape the constant watching, the constant dread. But the worst part was that they didn't know who the Watcher was. There were no suspects. No clear answers. The Broadduses had no idea who was behind it, and that uncertainty made everything worse. It wasn't until later that Derek and Maria realized the Watcher wasn't just threatening them with the letters. The Watcher was playing a game. A dangerous, sick game. And they were trapped in it. Weeks passed, and yet the letters did not stop. The daily delivery of envelopes filled with cryptic, unsettling messages was like an endless drumbeat that echoed through Derek's mind. The dread that once felt like an ominous presence now felt like a heavy weight on his chest. The more the Watcher wrote, the more personal the notes became. The family's every move seemed known, as if their lives were no longer their own. The phone calls continued as well, always the same. That low, whispering voice? That chilling declaration, "I'm watching you." Each time Derek picked up the phone, the words froze him in place. Each time, the line went dead before he could ask who was calling, before he could demand an answer. Derek and Maria, desperate and terrified, turned to the police once again. They had been told from the start that there wasn't much they could do. The letters weren't overtly threatening, and the phone calls were too vague to trace. The Broadduses were left with little more than unanswered questions and a feeling of helplessness. One day, Derek came home from work early. He had gotten a strange gut feeling as he drove down the street. The house looked different. The same feeling he had every time he stepped through the front door was now more intense. It was as if someone had walked through it just moments before him, touching things, moving things. The house seemed alive with an eerie energy. As he opened the front door, a sickening realization set in. There was a new letter tucked under the mat. Derek stood there for a moment, staring at it. His mind screamed to just leave it, to burn it, to never read it. But curiosity and terror pushed him forward. The handwriting was familiar now, the uneven letters a constant reminder of the dread that had taken over their lives. Derek unfolded it slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. "I know you've been trying to figure out who I am, but you will never find me. I have been here longer than you can imagine, watching this house long before you ever set foot in it. Your family is mine now. I have marked this house with my presence. I will watch your children grow. You cannot escape." A chill ran down Derek's spine as he read the words. The Watcher was no longer pretending to be an outsider. They were claiming ownership of the house of the Broaddus family's lives. They were warning them, "You cannot escape." In a fit of rage and fear, Derek grabbed the letter and stormed outside. He ran to the neighbors' houses, hoping that someone had seen something, anything, that could provide some answers. But no one had. Everyone seemed to be unaware of what was happening in 657 Boulevard. The neighbors were friendly, sure, but not one of them had seen anything suspicious. No one knew who the Watcher could be. Weeks of silence fell after the last letter. Derek and Maria began to hope, just a little, that the Watcher had finally given up. Maybe they were just a sick prankster, or perhaps they had grown bored of the torment. But deep down, they both knew better. They couldn't shake the fear that the Watcher was simply biding their time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. And then, one cold November evening, it happened. Derek had just finished dinner and was sitting in the living room with Maria when he heard it. A knock on the door. It wasn't a sound they were used to hearing. Their neighbors were friendly but never visited unannounced. Derek stood up, hesitating. Maria's eyes widened in fear, but Derek forced a smile and walked toward the door. When he opened it, no one was there. Just an empty porch, the street lamps casting long shadows across the lawn. He stepped outside, confused. But then he saw it. On the steps, there was a small package. No note. Just the package, waiting for him to pick it up. His heart raced. He glanced around, but there was no sign of anyone. No movement in the shadows. With trembling hands, Derek reached down and grabbed the package. It was light, almost too light. Inside, he found a small, intricately carved wooden box. It looked old, weathered, and had strange markings on the top. There was no return address, no explanation, just the box. Derek felt his breath catch in his throat. He didn't want to open it. He wanted to throw it away, forget it ever existed. But something inside him, the same thing that had kept him reading every letter, listening to every call, drove him to open it. Inside the box was a note. No words, just a picture. The picture was of his children taken from a distance, but clearly from inside the house. The picture showed his daughter in her pink room sitting on her bed. Her back was to the camera, her face unseen, but there was no mistaking it. The image was taken while she was in the house. The note attached to the picture simply read, "I see you." Derek's hand trembled as he dropped the picture back into the box. His pulse raced and his mind began to spiral. How had the watcher gotten that photo? How had they been inside the house? The Broadduses had double-checked every window and door. They had even set up motion sensor lights outside. Yet somehow the watcher had gotten in. It was impossible to ignore it any longer. The watcher wasn't just playing games. They were becoming more brazen, more daring. The terror that had once been confined to the letters and phone calls had now crossed into the physical realm. The watcher was not just observing anymore, they were actively involved in their lives. Derek stood in the doorway, holding the box, the weight of it pulling him down. He wanted to call the police, but at this point, he was sure it wouldn't do any good. What could they do? There were no leads, no suspects, just an anonymous, faceless entity watching them. He turned to Maria, his face pale. "I don't know what to do anymore. It's real. The watcher is real." Maria's eyes filled with fear. She had always believed in the letters, in the phone calls, but the picture? That had shattered the thin veil of disbelief she had been clinging to. But it wasn't just the watcher they were afraid of now. It was the unknown. The idea that someone, somewhere, had so thoroughly infiltrated their lives. That was what terrified them most. And as Derek stared at the picture of his daughter, he knew with gut-wrenching certainty that the watcher had been closer to them than they could ever have imagined. The horror was only just beginning. Derek didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. The wooden box, with its strange markings and haunting picture, lay on the coffee table before him, its presence weighing on him like a curse. His mind was in turmoil. He kept replaying every detail, the knock on the door, the empty porch, the box. He kept imagining how someone could have slipped inside the house, unnoticed, even though he had checked every door and window himself. The idea of a stranger inside their home, watching his children, was almost too much to bear. Maria had long since gone to bed, but Derek stayed up, staring at the picture. He tried to make sense of it. How could someone have taken such a clear photo of their daughter inside their home without them knowing? Had the watcher been inside their house while they slept? The thought alone made his skin crawl. The next morning, the reality of the situation set in like a cold fist around Derek's heart. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't a prank. The watcher had crossed a line, and they weren't going to stop. Derek's gut told him that the watcher was closing in. They knew them too well, too intimately. It felt as though the watcher had already claimed this house as their own, and the Broadduses were merely intruders in their territory. Derek and Maria knew they had to take action. They could no longer just wait for the next letter to arrive. They couldn't sit idly by as the watcher grew bolder. But what could they do? How could they protect themselves from an enemy who knew everything about them and who was seemingly everywhere? Derek called the police again. This time he insisted on speaking with someone higher up. He was desperate. The investigation had gone nowhere. The officers had come, taken the letters, and left. But no one had taken the time to actually look into who was behind the letters, who was behind the phone calls, who was behind the pictures. They were still no closer to answers. But then, the detective they spoke to dropped a bombshell. "Maybe you should move out for a while," the officer suggested. "Leave the house. It might be the safest thing for you." Derek's heart sank. It felt like a cop-out, like the police were telling him to just run away, to give up. It felt like they were abandoning them. But Derek wasn't ready to give up. He wasn't going to let the watcher chase them from their home. They had already spent months trying to figure out what was going on, and they had nothing to show for it except fear and confusion. They were trapped. And that thought alone made Derek's blood boil. Maria, too, had reached her breaking point. The constant fear was wearing her down. The phone calls, the letters, the photos, they were taking a toll on her. She couldn't sleep. She jumped at every sound. Every knock on the door sent her into a panic. It wasn't just the fear anymore, it was the sheer exhaustion of living in a constant state of dread. The once peaceful house had become a prison. The walls, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now felt suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside made them both flinch. They had lost their sense of safety, their sense of control. And they both knew that nothing, absolutely nothing, would bring that back. The watcher wasn't just watching anymore. They were now controlling the narrative. The fear they instilled in Derek and Maria was no longer a passive threat, it was an active, looming presence that surrounded them. One night, Derek decided to take matters into his own hands. He couldn't live like this anymore, unable to act, unable to fight back. He'd spent weeks obsessing over the idea of confronting the Watcher, trying to figure out who it was, why they were doing this. But the more he thought about it, the more it seemed like the Watcher didn't want to be found. The Watcher didn't want answers, they wanted to torment him, to slowly drive him and his family to the edge of insanity. It was a cold evening when Derek decided to install security cameras around the house. He had always been skeptical of technology, but now it felt like their only chance at catching the Watcher in the act. The cameras wouldn't provide any answers, they wouldn't tell him who was behind the torment, but maybe, just maybe, they could catch a glimpse of the person responsible. For hours, Derek set up cameras, placing them in every corner of the house, both inside and out. He installed motion detectors and floodlights, hoping that would be enough to deter the Watcher from continuing their strange campaign. Maria was uneasy about the cameras, but Derek insisted they were necessary. The Watcher had already crossed too many lines, and he wouldn't let them control his life any longer. The cameras were now the Broaddus family's last line of defense. If someone was watching them, they would catch it on tape. If someone had entered the house, they would have evidence. It felt like the only way to regain control, to finally get some answers. But even as Derek finished setting up the last of the cameras, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late. The Watcher had already won. Even if they caught the culprit on tape, what could they do? What could they prove? That night, as Derek lay in bed beside Maria, he heard it again. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, a tapping on the window. His heart leapt in his chest. He knew it was the Watcher, taunting him, daring him to confront them. Derek tried to stay calm, tried to focus on the motion detectors he had set up. The cameras would catch the intruder. They would have proof. But as he slowly approached the window, his breath caught in his throat. There, in the reflection of the glass, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure standing just outside the window, barely visible in the darkness. They were watching him, watching them. And Derek knew with chilling certainty that this nightmare was far from over. Derek's heart pounded in his chest as he stood frozen in front of the window. His eyes locked onto the reflection of the figure standing just outside, a dark silhouette barely discernible in the shadows. The world around him seemed to fade as the figure's presence washed over him. It was as if time itself had slowed down. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to run, to protect his family, but his feet refused to move. His breath came in shallow gasps as he stared into the dark reflection, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. For a moment, the figure didn't move. They just stood there, watching Derek through the glass. It was a sight so surreal that it didn't seem real. Was it the Watcher? Was this the same faceless entity who had tormented him and Maria for months? And then it happened. The figure's head tilted, slowly, as if they were studying Derek in the same way a predator might eye its prey. A cold shiver ran down his spine. They knew he was watching them. They knew he had seen them. The realization hit Derek like a punch to the gut. But it didn't end there. The figure, still standing motionless, slowly raised a hand. Derek's breath caught in his throat. The hand moved toward the window, and for a brief moment, Derek thought the figure would simply tap on the glass. But instead, the hand pressed against it as if testing the barrier between them. The eerie pressure of their touch against the window sent a shock of panic straight to Derek's core. For several long seconds, the figure stood there, pressing their hand against the cold glass, making no attempt to hide their presence. They were right outside, just inches away. Then, without warning, they took a step back. Derek quickly moved away from the window, his pulse racing. His mind was spinning, trying to process what had just happened. The cameras. The cameras were supposed to protect them. But had the figure seen them? Had they known Derek was watching too? He rushed toward the security system, frantically reviewing the footage from the cameras. He replayed the last few moments, but there was nothing. The figure was nowhere to be found. The motion sensors had triggered, but no one had appeared on the cameras. It was as if they had never been there. A sinking feeling settled in Derek's stomach. How could they have been so close? How could the Watcher have gotten so close without being captured on video? Maria appeared in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. Derek? What's happening? What's going on? Derek turned to her, his expression grim. They were outside, right outside the window. Maria's face went white. Did you see them? Did you see who it was? Derek shook his head. No. It was just a figure. I didn't get a good look. But they were standing right there, watching me. Maria stepped forward, her voice trembling. What do we do now? What if they come inside? What if they, Before she could finish, there was a loud crash from upstairs. The sound echoed through the house, sending both of them into a panicked frenzy. Derek grabbed Maria's arm, pulling her toward the staircase. They rushed up the steps, their hearts thundering in their chests. The house felt different now, empty, quiet, like a tomb. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow seemed darker. As they reached the second floor, they heard the sound again, a crash followed by a shuffling noise. Someone was in the house. Someone was in their house. Derek motioned for Maria to stay back as he slowly moved toward the source of the noise. He reached the master bedroom and peered around the corner. What he saw made his blood run cold. The window had been shattered. Glass was scattered across the floor and the curtains were drawn back, blowing gently in the wind. But the most terrifying part was what he saw lying on the floor, a small, wooden figurine. It was an object Derek had never seen before, but somehow it seemed familiar. It looked like a twisted version of the Watcher's carving, the same strange symbols he had seen on the wooden box that had arrived weeks ago. Derek's hand shook as he reached for the figurine. There was something wrong about it, something deeply unsettling. He turned it over and his breath caught in his throat. Etched into the base of the figurine was a message, barely visible but unmistakable. "I see you." The same words. The same phrase that had haunted him for months. Maria stepped forward, her voice barely a whisper. "Derek, is this the Watcher's doing?" Derek nodded slowly, his mind racing. He couldn't explain how or why, but he knew this was the Watcher's mark. They had been here. They had breached their home in the dead of night without leaving a trace. Suddenly, the air felt thick with tension. Every corner of the house felt as though it was hiding something. Something that could jump out at them at any moment. Derek couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. That the Watcher was still watching. Still lurking somewhere. Waiting. The next few days were a blur of terror. The Broaddus's couldn't shake the fear that had consumed their lives. They couldn't go outside without checking their surroundings. Couldn't step into a room without wondering if someone had been there. Every knock on the door, every creak in the floorboards, made their hearts race with panic. The police, as always, had no answers. They had no leads, no suspects. The cameras had captured nothing. The motion detectors had been triggered, but there was no evidence of anyone in or around the house. It was as if the Watcher was a ghost, a phantom who could slip in and out of their lives without leaving a trace. Derek and Maria knew they couldn't live like this anymore. The constant fear, the constant uncertainty, it was driving them to the edge. They couldn't sleep. They couldn't function. Every time they looked out the window, they half expected to see the Watcher's face staring back at them. But the most terrifying thought of all was that they had no idea who the Watcher was. No clue. The police had interviewed all the neighbors, but no one had seen anything unusual. No one had seen anyone enter the house. No one had noticed anything out of place. It was like the Watcher had vanished. Derek tried to tell himself that they just needed to leave. That maybe, just maybe, getting away from the house would break the curse, would stop the madness. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. The Watcher had already made it clear that they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. And whatever that was, it was clear it wasn't over. Not yet. Derek and Maria could no longer pretend that things were normal. The house that once held so much promise, so much potential for their family, had transformed into a suffocating prison. Every creak, every gust of wind, every tap of a distant door was a potential threat. Their lives had become a twisted version of their worst nightmare, and it was only getting worse. The figurine, the shattered window, the messages scrawled in places they couldn't reach. They had left their mark on the house. It was as if the Watcher's presence was embedded within the walls themselves. But there was one thing the Broadduses hadn't considered. One thing they hadn't yet fully understood. The house itself was a part of the Watcher's game. It was a cold, rainy evening when Derek, unable to sleep, decided to return to the basement. He had spent days thinking about the strange events that had unfolded since the first letter arrived. The Watcher had known too much. They had seen his children. They had been inside their home, perhaps even before they moved in. Derek's mind spiraled as he pondered the one thing he hadn't thought about before. What if the house itself was the key? The basement had always been an afterthought. It was dark, cold, and smelled of old wood. The Broadduses had planned to turn it into a family recreation room, but they hadn't done much work there yet. But now, Derek felt a compulsion, a desperate need to explore it again. He had to know, had the Watcher been here before? Had they left something behind? Something that could explain everything? As he descended the stairs into the basement, his flashlight flickered slightly, the only light in the overwhelming darkness. The beam swept over old boxes, shelves stacked with unused furniture, and piles of forgotten belongings. His eyes scanned the room, looking for any sign of something out of place. But then he saw it. A section of the wall was different from the rest. The wood panels seemed slightly out of alignment, as if something had been hidden behind them. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but to Derek's trained eyes, it was enough. With trembling hands, he pulled at the loose panels, his heart racing as he worked to expose the hidden space behind the wall. The gap widened, revealing something strange. An old, decaying piece of paper wedged into the gap. Derek pulled it free, his breath shallow as he unfolded it. What he found wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a letter, and this letter was addressed to the previous owners. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was the same slanted, uneven script as the letters that had haunted him and Maria. The Watcher's handwriting. Derek's hands shook as he read it. To the owners of 657 Boulevard, I am the Watcher. I have been watching for years. I know your secrets. I know the things you keep hidden. But do not fear, I am patient. I will wait. This house is mine, always has been, and I will watch all who live here, from the shadows, from behind the walls. They will never be free. Derek's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a threat, it was a declaration. The Watcher had been here long before he and Maria had moved in. They had known about the previous owners too. And worse yet, it seemed like they had been watching every single family that had ever lived in this house. The house wasn't just a structure. It was a trap. A place that fed on fear, that held the Watcher's attention like a moth to a flame. Derek's thoughts began to spiral. The Watcher wasn't just a person. They were a presence. An entity. Something that had claimed this house as its own, something that fed on the fear of those who dared to live within it. He raced up the stairs, heart pounding, and found Maria in the living room. Her face was pale, but she looked relieved to see him. Derek, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. I have, Derek whispered, barely able to catch his breath. Maria, I found something. Maria stood up, her eyes wide with concern. What? What did you find? Derek handed her the letter. Her hands shook as she read the words, her expression growing more and more horrified. When she finished, she slowly looked up at him, her voice trembling. This means the Watcher has been here for a long time. We were just the next victims. Derek nodded grimly. We're not the first. We won't be the last. Maria's eyes darted around the room as if expecting something to jump out from the shadows. What do we do now? We can't stay here. This house, it's cursed. Derek clenched his fists. He had spent months trying to understand what was happening, trying to find a way to make sense of the Watcher's torment. But now everything was starting to fall into place. This wasn't just about him or Maria. This was something much larger. Something far more terrifying. The Watcher was a part of the house, and they weren't going to stop until they had driven every family to the edge of madness. Derek's mind raced. There had to be a way to fight back. They couldn't just leave. This was their home. They had to figure out who the Watcher was, where they had come from, and why they were doing this. But the more Derek thought about it, the more he realized that he didn't have the answers. He didn't even know where to begin. And that's when the phone rang again. Derek didn't hesitate. He grabbed the receiver, his hands cold with sweat. Hello? There was no response. Just the heavy silence on the other end. Then, a voice, low and raspy, a whisper that made Derek's blood freeze in his veins. I'm watching you. The line went dead. Derek slammed the receiver down, his heart racing. He looked at Maria, his face pale. It's them. The Watcher. They're still here. They never left. Maria clung to him, her eyes wide with fear. What are we going to do, Derek? What if they come for us? What if they, Before she could finish, there was a loud knock at the door. Derek's heart stopped. He looked at the clock, midnight. Who could be at the door at this hour? Without a word, he turned to Maria. The fear in her eyes mirrored his own. Whoever it was, they weren't supposed to be there. The Watcher had found them again. The knock on the door echoed through the empty house like a death knell. Derek and Maria froze, staring at each other across the room. The air in the house was thick with dread, the silence hanging heavy like a suffocating shroud. For a moment, neither of them moved. The fear that had been creeping over them for months now felt like a suffocating presence, tightening around their throats. The knock came again, this time more insistent. Maria's voice trembled as she whispered, who could it be? It's after midnight. Derek's heart hammered in his chest. He glanced toward the front door, his mind racing with possibilities. Could it be a neighbor? Or worse, was it the Watcher daring them to open the door to face the horror that had been stalking them for so long? He didn't want to open it, but the knocking persisted, growing louder, more frantic. It was as if whoever was on the other side knew they were in the house, knew they were listening. The fear built up inside Derek, pressing against his chest until he felt like he couldn't breathe. He had to face it. He had to confront whatever was on the other side. Reluctantly, he walked toward the door, each step heavier than the last. When he reached the front, his hand hovered over the doorknob, shaking. His mind raced through every possibility, but none of them offered a solution. No matter who was behind that door, it couldn't be good. He wasn't prepared to see the Watcher face to face. With one final breath, Derek threw open the door. Nothing. The porch was empty. There was no one standing there, no one to be seen. The streetlights cast long shadows, but the only sound was the wind rustling the leaves in the yard. He stared out into the night, confusion and fear mingling in his mind. But then he saw it. On the doorstep, at the edge of the light's reach, was an envelope. Its thick, weathered paper was the same as the others, yellowed, crinkled, and marked with the unmistakable handwriting of the Watcher. It was the final letter. The one that had been building up to this moment, to the terrible conclusion that Derek and Maria had been dreading. Derek bent down slowly, the fear almost paralyzing him as he reached for the envelope. It felt heavy in his hands, a weight that seemed too much to bear. With shaking fingers, he tore it open. Dearest new neighbors, you've been a part of my observation for far too long. I have watched you, watched your children grow. Your house has become my home, my domain. You came here thinking you could escape your past, but you were wrong. I have been watching you for years, and I will watch until you are no more. I am the Watcher. I have watched you every night. I know your fears. I know your secrets. And you will never escape me. Derek's breath caught in his throat. The words were like ice, each sentence seeping into his mind, leaving an indelible mark. The Watcher wasn't just watching, they were waiting for something. Something inevitable. They were patient, and they had been waiting for this moment. It was as if the Watcher had been planning for the day when Derek and Maria would reach their breaking point. And now, it felt like they had been caught in an endless cycle of fear. Maria appeared behind Derek, her face pale, her eyes wide with horror. What does it say? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Derek handed her the letter, unable to speak. He watched as her eyes scanned the words, her face turning white as she read. When she finished, she looked up at him, her expression filled with terror. It's not just us, Derek. The Watcher, they've been watching everyone. The realization hit Derek like a punch to the gut. The Watcher had been observing every family that had ever lived here, waiting for them to move in, to claim the house as their own. They had been a part of the house's history woven into its very fabric. And now it was their turn. The finality of the letter settled in. There was no more room for doubt. The Watcher wasn't just an ordinary person. They were a force, a presence, a part of the house itself. They had been here long before Derek and Maria had ever arrived. And now there was no escape, no place to hide. But as Derek stood there, holding the letter in his hands, his mind began to race. The Watcher had been watching them for years. They knew everything about them, everything. They knew their deepest fears, their darkest secrets. And yet, there was one thing they didn't know. One thing that could change everything. Derek's mind flashed to the strange carvings on the walls, to the figure he had seen outside the window. The Watcher had made it clear they had been watching all the families who had ever lived in 657 Boulevard. But the house wasn't just a prison for the Broadduses. It had been a prison for everyone who came before them. And that gave Derek one idea, one slim hope. He turned to Maria, his voice shaking but filled with determination. We need to get out. Now. Before it's too late. Maria looked at him, her eyes searching his face. What do you mean? We can't leave. We can't just run away from the Watcher. We can't stay here, Maria. We need to leave for good. We need to burn the house down. Maria stared at him, shocked, but Derek's eyes were filled with a fierce resolve. The Watcher's been in this house for years. They've been feeding off the fear of every family that has ever lived here. But we can stop it. We can stop the cycle. Maria's mouth opened and closed as she processed his words. Slowly, she nodded. You're right. This house is never going to let us go. It's feeding on us. We need to stop it, end it. Derek's heart raced as he reached for the phone. He had to act fast. They had to get out of this nightmare before it consumed them entirely. But as he reached for the phone, the ground seemed to tremble beneath their feet, and a strange, cold chill filled the air. In the distance, faintly, the sound of knocking echoed through the house again. This time, it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from deep within the walls. The knocking started again. This time, it wasn't just a random noise. It wasn't just a creak or a bump in the night. It was methodical, rhythmic, a persistent, unrelenting sound that seemed to reverberate through the very walls of the house. The walls themselves were alive, breathing, as though they were waiting for something to happen. Derek and Maria stood frozen in the hallway, the chill in the air thickening around them. The knocking had become louder, closer, until it felt as if it were coming from right inside the walls themselves, just inches away from them. It was a noise so chilling that it rattled them to their core, sending them into a cold sweat. Maria grabbed Derek's arm, her voice trembling. "What is that? What's happening?" Derek's eyes darted around the house, his mind racing. The walls had never made sounds like this before. It was as if something or someone was trapped inside them, trying to escape, trying to make contact. He clenched his fists, his heart pounding. This wasn't just the Watcher. No, it was something deeper, something older. The house wasn't just a victim of the Watcher's presence, it was alive. And it had been alive long before they moved in. Suddenly, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Derek's breath caught in his throat. The tension was unbearable. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But then, just as quickly as the silence had descended, it was shattered by a low, guttural sound, like something scraping against the inside of the walls. Derek's eyes widened. The sound was unmistakable. It was a voice. Not just any voice, a whisper. Soft, raspy, but unmistakably there. Maria's face paled as she whispered, "Did you hear that?" Derek nodded slowly, his body rigid with fear. "It's coming from the walls. Someone's inside." The whisper grew louder. They could make out the words now, but they were strange, fragmented, as though the voice was coming from a great distance. "I'm watching. You can't escape." The words were broken, each one stretched out as if the voice were struggling to be heard. The sound crawled under their skin, filling the house with a sense of dread that seemed to seep into their very bones. The Watcher's presence was all-encompassing now. It wasn't just in the house, it was part of it. Derek couldn't take it anymore. He moved toward the wall, his hands shaking as he placed them on the cold surface. He pressed his ear against the wall, his heart racing as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Maria grabbed his arm. "What are you doing?" "Don't." But Derek didn't listen. The wall felt wrong. It was colder than it should have been, and the sound of the whispering voice seemed to reverberate through his head, making it difficult to think clearly. The walls weren't just barriers, they were conduits. Channels for the Watcher's presence, for whatever malevolent force had taken hold of this house. Suddenly, with a loud crack, a section of the wall near the stairs splintered, revealing a hidden compartment. Dust and debris poured from the opening, but what lay inside made Derek's stomach churn. It was a collection of old photographs, faded and yellowed with age. At first, Derek thought it was just a random assortment of family portraits, nothing special. But then he saw the details. The faces. The people in the photos. They were all former residents of 657 Boulevard. Derek stumbled back, his mind racing. There were dozens of pictures, each one showing a different family, all posing in the same place, right in front of the house. But there was something else in every photo. The eyes. Every single person in each picture had their eyes carefully crossed out, as if someone had deliberately chosen to erase them. Maria reached out, trembling as she picked up one of the photos. It was a family from the 1980s, standing outside the house with forced smiles, their faces obscured by dark marks across their eyes. "Oh my God," she whispered, horrified. "It's like the Watcher has been doing this for years. They've been watching everyone." Derek turned pale, his thoughts racing as he pieced everything together. The house, the Watcher, the letters, they weren't just part of a sick game. They were part of something much larger. This house had been a site of torment for every family that had lived there. The Watcher had watched and marked each family in the same way. But why? Before Derek could voice the question, a cold gust of wind rushed through the room, extinguishing the candles they had lit. The temperature in the house plummeted, and the whispering voice in the walls grew louder, now filled with urgency. "You are next. You cannot leave. I see you." The whispering grew more frantic, and Derek felt a sharp pressure in his chest, as though the air itself was pressing down on him. He stumbled back from the wall, his heart pounding in his ears. The voice wasn't coming from just the walls anymore. It was everywhere. The house had become a living, breathing entity, and it was speaking to them. It was telling them that they were already a part of it, that they were trapped in a never-ending cycle of terror. Derek and Maria backed away from the wall, but the whispering continued. It didn't stop. It filled the house, filling every corner, every crack. The house itself had become a conduit for the Watcher's voice, for the spirit that had haunted it for decades. The figure that had been outside their window, the strange carvings, the figurine in the basement, everything was part of the same twisted web. The Watcher wasn't just a person. They were something far darker, a manifestation of the house's curse. The house had created the Watcher, or perhaps it had always been there, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And now it seemed that moment had come. Derek's mind raced. They couldn't stay. They had to leave. But the house wouldn't let them. The walls, the very foundation of 657 Boulevard, seemed to be closing in around them. Just as the whispering reached a deafening crescendo, the front door slammed shut with a force that shook the entire house. The lights flickered and then went out completely, plunging them into darkness. Derek's pulse raced. He couldn't see anything. He couldn't hear anything except the pounding of his heart. But then he heard it. A voice, clear, sharp, and right behind him. "You are mine now." And with that, the house fell silent. The house was silent, but the silence was worse than any sound. Derek stood in the pitch-black hallway, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The walls, which had once been a barrier to the outside world, now felt like they were closing in on him. The darkness pressed in from every side, thick and suffocating. The air was cold, far colder than it should have been, and a sense of impending doom hung heavy in the atmosphere. Maria's hand gripped his tightly, her fingers shaking. She was right beside him, but in the dark, it felt like they were miles apart. She too was scared, terrified. They both were. "Derek," Maria whispered, her voice barely audible. "We need to get out of here, now, before it's too late." Her words echoed in Derek's mind. Before it's too late. But what did that even mean anymore? Was it already too late? Could they escape? He couldn't answer her. He couldn't make any promises. The Watcher's words, "You are mine now," had been seared into his mind, and he couldn't shake the fear that it was true. What if the house had claimed them? What if they were already a part of its twisted history, doomed to be forgotten like every family before them? "Derek," Maria repeated, shaking his arm. "We need to go now." That brought him back to the present. His mind cleared, and he focused on Maria's desperate face in the dark. The Watcher wasn't here, not physically at least, but the house had become a prison. The walls, the air, the darkness itself felt alive. There was no way to fight this force, no way to reason with it. They had tried to leave before, but the Watcher had always been there, watching them from the shadows, even when they couldn't see him. He had to get them out. It was their only chance. "Let's go," he said, his voice low but firm. They moved quickly, navigating the house as best as they could in the dark. Every step they took was filled with fear, the sensation of being pursued gnawing at them. The house creaked and groaned, as though it were waking from a long slumber. Derek could feel the floor shifting beneath his feet, the walls seeming to pulse with a dark, malevolent energy. As they reached the front door, Derek's heart leapt. The door, the one place that could be their escape. He reached for the doorknob, but when his hand touched it, he froze. The door locked. It was locked, but they had never locked it before. They hadn't even used the lock. Maria gasped, pulling on the doorknob in panic. "It's locked. How is it locked?" The hairs on the back of Derek's neck stood up. This wasn't just a coincidence. It was the house. The house had trapped them inside. A low, sinister laugh echoed from somewhere deep within the walls. It was so soft at first, like a whisper in the distance, but it grew louder, closer, more distinct, until it seemed to come from all around them. The Watcher. Derek slammed his shoulder against the door, his body crashing into it with all the force he could muster. The door didn't budge. He tried again, pushing with everything he had, but it was no use. Maria was in a panic, tugging on the door, pulling on the handle. Her face was streaked with tears, her voice rising in desperation. "Derek, please, we can't stay here. We have to get out." But there was no escape. Derek stepped back, his mind racing. He looked around. The house was shifting, changing. It was alive with the sound of whispers and creaks. The walls seemed to close in on them with every passing second. They weren't just trapped by a locked door. They were trapped by the house itself. The knocking began again, louder this time, filling the air with a deafening rhythm. It was coming from everywhere, from the walls, from the floors, from the ceiling. It was a sound that was inescapable. The house itself was knocking, as if it were calling to them, beckoning them deeper into its dark heart. "No!" Derek shouted, shaking his head. "We can't stay here. We can't." Maria's voice broke through the chaos. "Derek, look!" He turned to her, his heart skipping a beat when he saw what she was pointing at. The walls around them were shifting. The wood, the plaster, it was moving. Like a living thing, the walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting as though the house were alive. The sound of scraping began again, but this time it wasn't just the walls. The floorboards creaked, and then from beneath them, something pulled. Derek backed away, fear seizing him. The house wasn't just a building. It was a creature, a malevolent force that wanted them to stay, to become part of its dark history. And the Watcher was its eyes. The Watcher was part of the house. "We need to go. We need to get out." Maria screamed, her voice breaking. In that moment, something inside Derek snapped. He wasn't going to let the house win. Not like this. He wasn't going to let it take his family. He ran toward the stairs, his mind racing for any way out. The knocking grew louder, more frantic, but Derek didn't care anymore. He had to get out. They had to survive. With one final push, Derek and Maria ran up the stairs, reaching the second floor. But the house was moving faster than they were. The walls shifted in front of them, creating a wall of solid wood and plaster. They couldn't go forward. The knocking, the scraping, the whispers, they were everywhere. The house was alive, closing in around them, and it wouldn't let them leave. Suddenly, Derek spotted something out of the corner of his eye. A window. The same window that had been shattered days before. The same window that the Watcher had been outside of. It was their only chance. He ran toward it, but as he did, something caught his foot. He stumbled, but Maria grabbed him, pulling him up. "Derek, please. Don't." He ignored her and reached for the window. With a burst of strength, he yanked it open. The cold night air rushed in, and for a moment, Derek felt free. But then, the walls seemed to shudder as if protesting their escape. "We can't go back," Derek said, his voice harsh with fear. "We have to jump." Maria hesitated, looking out into the dark yard below. It was a long drop, too long. But there was no time. They had no other choice. With a final glance at the house, Derek pulled Maria through the window, and together they jumped. The ground came up too fast. Derek's body hit the earth with a painful thud, but he didn't feel it. He was too focused on getting up, pulling Maria to her feet, and running as fast as they could. Behind them, the house stood silent. But in the distance, they could hear something. A whisper. A soft, unsettling laugh. They ran. And they didn't stop. Derek and Maria ran without looking back. The cold night air bit at their skin, but the terror in their hearts kept them moving faster. They didn't stop. They didn't look to see if the house was still there, looming behind them like a dark shadow. They didn't want to know. All they cared about was getting as far away as possible from 657 Boulevard, from the house that had tormented them for so long. But as they reached the edge of the property, a strange sensation washed over Derek. It was the same feeling he had experienced since the first letter arrived, the unmistakable sense of being watched. He stopped for a moment, glancing over his shoulder, his eyes darting toward the house. The looming presence of the place was still there, standing tall in the distance, its windows dark and empty. Maria, too, had slowed down. She turned to Derek, her breath shallow and her face pale. "What is it?" she whispered. "What's wrong?" Derek didn't answer at first. The hair on the back of his neck stood up and his pulse quickened. Something wasn't right. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, a cold, gnawing dread that had been with him ever since they moved into that house. The Watcher. The presence. It was still out there. "It's the house," Derek said, his voice tight. "It's like it's watching us." Maria's eyes widened and she grabbed his arm. "No. We're free now. It's over. We got out." But Derek didn't believe it. He had to face the truth. The Watcher wasn't just a person. It was something more. The house itself had been the Watcher's prison, its sanctuary. And now that they had left, Derek had an undeniable feeling that the house wouldn't let them go so easily. Suddenly, a sound broke the stillness of the night. A soft, distant whisper. Derek's heart froze. It was unmistakable. The voice he had heard through the walls, in the darkness, it was calling to them. "I see you." The hair on his arms stood on end as the whisper echoed through the air. It wasn't coming from the house anymore. It was coming from all around them. From the very trees, the ground beneath their feet. It was as though the Watcher had extended its presence far beyond the confines of the house. Derek, Maria whispered, her voice trembling. What do we do? Derek didn't have an answer. The terror they had lived with for so long had followed them, seeping into the very fabric of the world around them. The house wasn't just a place. It was a curse, a living, breathing thing that couldn't be outrun. The whisper grew louder, until it was no longer just a whisper. It was a voice, a distinct sound that made Derek's blood run cold. You can't escape me. You belong to me now. You always will. It wasn't just the house speaking. It was the Watcher. Derek's mind spun. He had thought they were free, that they had escaped the nightmare. But now it was clear. The Watcher wasn't a person. It wasn't something they could fight. It was a presence, an entity that had existed long before them and would continue to exist long after they were gone. He turned to Maria, his face pale and drawn. We can't outrun it. The Watcher, it's not just in the house. It's everywhere. Maria shook her head, tears streaming down her face. What are we supposed to do? What's going to happen to us? Derek didn't know. He couldn't explain it. They had tried to fight, to escape, but it felt like the Watcher had already won. They were trapped in an endless cycle, doomed to be a part of the house's dark history. It was as if the Watcher had always been waiting for them to arrive, for them to become the next victims. But then, as Derek stood there, paralyzed with fear, something changed. The whispering stopped. The air around them grew still, as though the world itself was holding its breath. The temperature dropped even further, the cold biting through their clothes. The moment felt suspended in time, like a brief pause before the inevitable. And then, in the distance, Derek saw it. The house was moving. The windows flickered, as though something was watching from inside. The shadows seemed to shift, coiling like tendrils, reaching out toward them. Maria gasped, clutching Derek's arm tighter. What's happening? Derek's heart raced. He realized that the house wasn't just a building. It wasn't just bricks and wood. It was alive, or it had become alive, feeding off the fear of every family that had lived there. It had created the Watcher, or maybe the Watcher had created it. But either way, they were bound to each other, forever intertwined in a cycle of horror. The house was calling to them now. It was pulling them back. It wouldn't let them go. Derek shook his head. No, we can't go back. We won't. He grabbed Maria's hand and started running again. Faster this time, not stopping to look back. The whispering began again. Louder now, more frantic, as if the Watcher were closing in on them, following their every move. They ran for what felt like hours, their legs burning, their lungs screaming for air. But no matter how far they went, no matter how fast they ran, the house never seemed to get further away. It felt as though they were running in circles, trapped in an inescapable loop. The world around them started to blur, the trees and the road melting together in a haze. The ground beneath their feet seemed to shift, and Derek stumbled, falling to his knees. No! He screamed, pushing himself back up. We can't stop. We can't. But then, as they ran, something extraordinary happened. The ground beneath them cracked. The earth trembled, and with a final, deafening sound, the ground split wide open. The earth swallowed everything in its path. The trees, the road, the house. It was as if the very foundation of 657 Boulevard was collapsing, consumed by the darkness it had created. Derek and Maria stood frozen as the earth caved in around them, pulling the house down into the abyss. The whispering grew to a deafening crescendo, then was suddenly silenced as the house vanished, consumed by the ground below. For a moment, everything was still. Then, in the silence that followed, Derek and Maria realized that the Watcher was gone. The presence that had haunted them, the force that had tormented them for so long, had been swallowed up by the earth. It was over. Derek and Maria stood there, breathless and broken, but free. The sun was rising on the horizon, and as they looked out at the now quiet land, they knew that the nightmare had finally come to an end. But as they walked away, the wind carried with it a faint, lingering whisper. I'm still watching.